let's unpack this. We're jumping into a source today that takes a really close look at events in Turkey, particularly over the past decade or so. And these are events that, according to this text anyway, have profoundly impacted, well, hundreds of thousands of people.
Absolutely. In this source, it really zeroes in on the systematic actions taken against one group in particular, the Hizmet movement. Its central argument, really, is that these actions, they're not just about recent politics. They might suggest something much deeper.
Something structural, maybe?
Yeah, potentially rooted in the very structure of the state itself. That's what the source seems to argue.
Right. So our mission then in this deep dive is to really get inside this source's perspective. We want to understand its main points, the history it uses to back them up, and the core ideas it's presenting about, well, how this whole process works according to the text.
Exactly. We're here to understand the source's view. What information does it lay out?
What's the viewpoint being presented based just on what the text itself provides?
Precisely.
Great. So the source kicks off with a core premise. It suggests that what's happened isn't just about those big recent events that, made headlines internationally.
Right. Not solely the 1725 December investigations back in 2013.
The corruption allegations.
Or even the attempted coup on July 15, 2016. The source says it goes beyond that.
That's its foundation, isn't it? It highlights the sheer scale of what it says happened over the last decade.
Yeah, things like mass dismissals from jobs. And often, it claims, without individual crimes being proven.
Passport cancellation.
Seizure of assets, widespread imprisonment, which obviously led to families being separated.
And forced exile for many. A huge impact.
Huge. And the source contends that the roots of this level of action are actually far older, structural, going back decades.
Okay, so not just a reaction to recent events, but something with a longer history?
Exactly. It argues there's this striking historical consistency in the type of accusations made against the movement. Way back, even to the 1970s.
And the charges are similar over time.
Remarkably similar, according to the text. Things like changing the constitutional order, or infiltrating the state, or founding a secret organization. These phrases keep reappearing, it says.
And it gives examples, right, to illustrate this long-term pattern.
It does. It points to a specific, quite telling early example. Way back in the 1960s, it describes Fethullah Gulen and 6 others in Adarna. They were simply reading from a collection of hadith, sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, up in a mosque loft.
Just reading together.
That's what the source says. But what followed, according to the text, was a police raid. They were taken to the station, apparently mistreated, insulted. And the text really emphasizes that the authorities found, well, nothing.
No political organization. No crime.
Nothing like that. The source states the only crime identified was simply reading a religious text together. And it presents this incident as setting a kind of pattern.
That really underlines the source's point about some kind of underlying state reflex. Does it track this pattern forward?
It does, yeah. It looks at subsequent periods, showing similar dynamics, or so it argues. It mentions a conviction in 1971, which the source claims happened despite a lack of evidence.
Okay.
Then, after the 1980 military coup, it says Gulen was effectively a fugitive for 6 years, facing those same kinds of long-standing accusations.
Right. And then the 90s, the 28 February period, that was intense.
Very intense. And the source notes that even though security reports reportedly, even from the military's general staff, found no criminal element, a state security court initially convicted him anyway.
But that wasn't the end of it, legally, was it?
No. And this is revealing, as the source points out, that conviction was challenged and eventually the Supreme Court General Assembly acquitted Gulen.
On what grounds?
Citing the lack of evidence for those accusations, the very things he'd been accused of for years.
So the source uses this whole historical path, this trajectory, to draw a conclusion.
A strong one. It argues this history shows a deep-seated state reflex in Turkey. A reflex that, as the source puts it, doesn't just identify an enemy, but actively works to produce a scapegoat, especially during tense times.
And it connects that historical pattern right up to the present day.
Directly. It argues that what we're seeing now is like I think it calls it a digital age version of that same old reflex.
So the tools change, media, technology, but the fundamental mindset persists.
That's the argument. The mindset of finding an internal enemy, making them a scapegoat, it continues, just with modern methods.
What's interesting there is how it weaves these incidents together. It's not just isolated events, but evidence for a consistent pattern in state behavior, according to the source.
Exactly. It's arguing this isn't new, just an old pattern with maybe new justifications or tools.
Okay. Moving on a bit, the source also digs into how the movement is portrayed publicly. It talks a lot about demonization and hate speech.
Yes, it suggests there's this recurring tendency within certain influential circles in Turkey, an idea that antagonists are sort of, well, invented or
Hmm.
designated, especially when there's a crisis.
And it draws parallels with other historical figures.
It does. To make the
Yeah.
point, it's similar to how, say, Bediüzzaman Said Nursi was called a hat enemy, referring to his stance on dress codes back then.
Okay.
Or Suleiman Hilmi Tunahan labeled sectarian for his religious teaching. Or even Nekmettin Erbakan, the Islamist politician, being called reactionary. It sees a pattern in the labeling itself.
And it argues the Gulen movement gets similar treatment now with specific labels.
Yes, labels like parallel structure or that derogatory acronym F2. The source calls these deliberate caricatures, designed purely to demonize.
And here's where the source makes a pretty stark claim, isn't it? It goes beyond just calling it political smearing.
It does. It argues this intense labeling isn't just harsh politics. In its view, it actually constitutes a form of hate crime.
That's a strong term. How does the source define hate crime in this context?
It uses a broad definition. Attacks, discrimination, or humiliation aimed at people because of their group identity. And it specifically clarifies that, in the Turkish context it's discussing, this definitely includes discrimination based on faith or religious group, not just ethnicity like maybe we sometimes think of it.
And what examples does it give of how this plays out in reality?
They're quite disturbing, actually. It mentions alleged instances of lynchings, public humiliation,
Wow.
detention practices described as torture-like, and even these chilling public calls, things like, don't even pity their children.
That's incredibly harsh language.
It is. And the source's argument is that this whole environment is deliberately fueled by collective hate speech. Its crucial point is that this doesn't just damage the group being targeted. It argues it actively poisons society's shared morality, the whole social fabric. The language itself becomes a weapon.
All right, let's shift gears just slightly. The source also tackles criticisms aimed at the movement, right? Specifically about this phrase, the destiny of the path.
Yes, it addresses that. It mentions that some critics feel the movement's leadership might seem, well, passive, like they didn't fight back hard enough against all the pressure.
And that they might use this phrase, the destiny of the path, as a kind of justification for inaction.
Exactly, or perceived inaction.
Yeah.
It even notes some critics suggest the movement should just disband, claiming this concept is used to shut down internal criticism of the leadership strategy.
But the source pushes back on that interpretation.
It does, directly and firmly. It states that reading it that way is just wrong, historically and ethically. It contradicts what it describes as Gulen's actual ethics of struggle.
So according to the source, the destiny of the path is not an excuse for just sitting back and taking it.
Definitely not.
Oh.
The source explains Gulen uses the phrase to highlight the inherent, almost unavoidable difficulties faced by those trying to follow a path of truth and service, as the source sees it. It gives these powerful examples from history, prophets facing slander, exile, even assassination. Or said Nussi, enduring prison and exile again and again.
So it's about acknowledging the difficulty of the path itself.
Yes, and the source makes a critical distinction. Acknowledging that suffering might be part of this destiny does not mean you should just accept oppression or passively surrender.
What does it mean then?
It means, according to the source, that this understanding actually requires patient, resilient, and dignified resistance when facing hardship.
And it connects this idea to how the movement actually acted, like with legal challenges.
Precisely. It argues Gulen's own willingness to use the legal system was an ethical stance, rooted in this understanding. The movement's history, as the source presents it, involves fighting media slander with lawsuits, challenging alleged conspiracies legally, always trying to operate within the law, even under intense pressure.
So the conclusion on this point is
That the destiny of the path, far from stopping legal or active struggle, actually deepens it. It provides a kind of consciousness, a moral framework that makes the struggle more meaningful, placing it in a larger context.
and there's a call to action linked to this.
Yes, a clear ethical imperative mentioned in the source. To be a voice for the silenced, to defend the weak, and to speak out to try and restore legality and justice.
So it reframes resistance. It's not necessarily about physical confrontation, but an active, ethical, often legal engagement driven by this sense of purpose.
That seems to be the core idea presented.
Okay, let's try and bring this all together now. Looking at the current situation through the source's lens, it essentially asks a big question. What really changed about the movement to justify everything that happened?
Right. It lists the common accusations you hear now against Hizmet secrecy, the parallel structure idea,
Huh?
infiltration, worries about its finances, the schools abroad, all those things.
Yeah, the standard list.
But then it points out something the source finds quite striking. According to the text, these are largely the exact same accusations that were being thrown around years, even decades earlier.
The same accusations.
Largely the same, yes. The source contends that the only thing that's significantly different now is the tactics being used against the movement. Well, it argues that in the past, it might have been more about old-style single-party era tactics or direct profiling by state bodies. Today, it's more about what it calls media lynchings, intense social media campaigns, label politics, using those dismissive terms to demonize instantly.
The source sums it up as.
Same slander, different package. That's the phrase it uses.
Okay. And this leads the source to pose that central question for us, for the listener to think about, doesn't it?
It does. Did Hizmet fundamentally change and suddenly become this major threat? Or is the system, the regime currently in power, simply looking for or maybe even fabricating a new internal enemy?
And the source answers its own question by looking back at the history it laid out.
Yes. It argues the movement faced these very same kinds of accusations, regardless of whether it was seen as being close to the state at the time or distant from it.
So in the source's view, the real issue isn't necessarily what the movement does, specific actions, but maybe what it represents.
Exactly that. According to the source, the biggest challenge Hizmet poses to the established system isn't specific plots, but its nature as an alternative. It points to values it associates with the movement, things like merit-based education, trying to build a transparent civil society focused on service, an emphasis on moral leadership, on conscience.
And the source argues these values are threatening.
Inherently unacceptable is the source's view, within a system that it characterizes as being built more on patronage, maybe bribery, favoritism, a lack of transparency.
Which is why the source asserts the movement is being targeted for what it calls liquidation, all under this broad terror label.
Yes. The source doesn't just see it as politics or law enforcement. It frames it as an ideological cleansing operation. Meaning, it argues these accusations aren't just about removing one group's influence. They're also used to discipline other dissenting voices, maybe even parts of the political opposition, bringing them into line.
And finally, on this point, the source suggests that accusing Hizmet serves another purpose.
Yeah, it argues it works as a kind of smokescreen, a distraction technique.
To hide what?
To hide, the source suggests.
Yeah.
The systemic decay, the corruption, the lack of accountability that it claims is happening within the state itself.
That's a really comprehensive and frankly quite sharp argument the source is putting forward there. It really shifts the focus.
It definitely does. It challenges you, the listener, to think about the motivations, the underlying dynamic, maybe beyond just the surface accusations.
Less about the specific alleged actions of the accused.
And more about the alleged nature and motives of the accuser and the system the source claims it represents.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into this particular source material, it really leaves you wrestling with a pretty significant dilemma, doesn't it?
It does. Is Hizmet genuinely guilty of all these massive accusations?
Yeah.
Or is the system itself using it as a profound, convenient scapegoat?
And the source, based on the patterns and arguments it lays out, strongly suggests
It leans heavily towards the latter. It argues the movement's history indicates the current situation isn't just a change in government policy. It's more like the manifestation of a persistent, underlying mentality or reflex within the state apparatus itself.
a reflex that doesn't necessarily change even when governments do.
That's the implication in the source. It's not necessarily about specific parties in power, but about an unchanging, oppressive tendency it sees within the state structure and mindset.
And the source broadens this out at the end, doesn't it? It argues this isn't just about Hizmet.
No, it contends this perceived state reflex impacts many other groups in Turkey. It mentions Kurds, Alevite, opposition journalists, leftists, academics, even just ordinary citizens who dissent or represent some kind of alternative.
So the source's final point is that what's happening to Hizmet isn't isolated. It claims it's part of a broader assault on what?
On fundamental elements of a free society, according to the text. Freedom of expression, the space for civil society to operate, religious pluralism.
That's why, the source argues, the struggle here isn't just about one group's fate. It's framed as a fundamental fight for justice, for conscience, for democratic values that impact everyone.
A much broader struggle, in its view.
And it leaves us with a really potent, maybe uncomfortable final thought to mull over, doesn't it?
It does, a provocative one. When this current situation eventually changes, and the source implies, it suggests that nobody who just silently watched this oppression unfold.
We'll be able to credibly claim innocence later by just saying, well, I was silent, but I was innocent.
Exactly. It's a stark call for reflection on the mortal weight of observation and perhaps inaction in the face of what it portrays as injustice.
And just briefly, the source does mention this is only part one.
Yes, right at the very end, it indicates this material is the first part of its analysis. It says the second part is planned, which will apparently delve into internal criticisms and even factionalism within the movement itself.
Interesting. So there are potentially more layers to explore from this source's perspective down the line.
It seems so. Suggests a more complex picture yet to come, even from this one perspective.